So I'm Ward Holder. I'm the director of the honors program, and I'm going to give it a couple of minutes because people are still wandering in. But it's so good to see such a strong response on a night when we weren't expecting to be off campus. All right. So I'm Ward Holder. I'm the director of the honors program here at St. Anselm College. And I'm excited to be introducing our speaker tonight. Professor Elizabeth Ossoff is professor of psychology at St. Anselm College. She is a graduate of Colby College, where she took a baccalaureate degree in psychology. She then did both her master's and PhD at Tufts University, concentrating on experimental psychology. After a brief stint of teaching at Tufts, she came to St. Anselm. She has served the college in a number of roles as a member of the Faculty Senate, as a mentor, and as a department chair. Professor Ossoff's work has spanned a number of topics. She has investigated the psychological factors that persuade voters. She has examined how political preference influences perceptions of terrorism. She has researched issues of gender. Accordingly, she is widely published, having published articles both jointly and solo authored in journals such as Social Psychology and International Perspective, the Journal of Social Behavior and Personality, Current Psychology, the Journal of Child Study, Eye on Psychi, the Journal of Public Deliberation, and the website Girl Zone. She has also contributed to a volume on the 2016 election, Conventional Wisdom, Parties and Broken Barriers in the 2016 election, published by Lexington Books. Tonight, Professor Ossoff's lecture is entitled Masks, Vaccines, and Conspiracy Theories: How Attitudes and Behaviors Can Change in a Pandemic. Welcome, Professor Ossoff.
Thank you, Ward. I'm happy to be here. This is an unusual time. I'm coming to you from my family room. Here, we're all remote, which is very strange. Normally, I would be in a lecture hall talking to people. Let me back up a minute and just say thank you for that introduction. It was very kind. It's always interesting when one is reminded of what one has done. But as Dr. Holder said, I am a psychologist and I specialize in social psychology. And as a social psychologist, I am interested in the scientific study of how individuals think about, are influenced, and relate to one another in a social environment. What we are dealing with today during the current pandemic is unique, to say the least, but I think it's also a great opportunity for psychology to contribute to our understanding of the behaviors that people are engaging in, and also some of the behaviors that perhaps we can encourage people to engage in. So in that vein, I am going to share my screen so that I can pull up my PowerPoint. And we will start talking about what we are focused on here tonight. So masks, vaccines, and conspiracy theories. I'm going to address those in order in my talk with a little bit of a prelim and speak to what we know about how attitudes and behaviors can change in a pandemic. And hopefully once I finish, there'll be enough time to answer some questions. Oops, too far. Okay. So this is the environment that we are dealing with right now. This is what we see. And it's important to understand why, on a very basic level, this is so uncomfortable and unique for us. We as human beings are social animals. We are designed to interact and to use many pieces of information to communicate with each other and infer information from each other. What you see on the screen here, this, masks, that already impedes your ability to both send information out into the world and read information from other people. We as a species are very adept at picking up nonverbal cues, social information from just the expression on people's faces, and you're losing half of that with the face being covered by a mask. You put that together with the combined anxiety that's created by the current pandemic, right? The fear that's associated with COVID-19. And you have a recipe for some very difficult outcomes in terms of what people will be able to accomplish with each other. Oops. Okay, so what I put here was just a simple timeline associated with the information that we got from the CDC. Okay, a year ago, January, we thought this was some mysterious disease that happened on the other side of the world, right? We didn't, in a million years, I think, immediately think it would have the implications that it has had. But if you look at the timeline, clearly the intensity with which this phenomenon engulfed the world was unprecedented, right? We started in, January. The CDC started recommending wearing masks by travelers, but not necessarily everybody. Suddenly, a public health emergency is declared. Suddenly, the World Health Organization declares it a pandemic. Next, the then president declared it a national emergency. Stay-at-home orders started being issued state by state. We started passing large numbers as far as number of deaths associated with this. And then as we got into the warmer weather, things started opening up again, and then they shut down again with the spike that happened in the fall. It wasn't until the middle to late December that we finally had some good news in the form of the first of the vaccines, and those vaccinations have begun. They're moving at a rapid clip, but not fast enough, in the sense that states are completely opening back up, and that is putting people in a more and more precarious position. So if there aren't going to be laws governing people, if there aren't going to be things that are going to have that kind of an impact, what other kinds of things are going to have an impact? And what are some of the other consequences of this timeline and this phenomenon we are experiencing? What I put up here is a diagram of something that is very well understood in the psychological literature and the health literature, and it's referred to as the general adaptation syndrome. So one consequence of prolonged stress is illustrated by this diagram, okay? It was developed by Hans Selye, and as you can see, what you have is 3 stages that are associated with prolonged stress. The initial stage is a shock phase. The individual is presented with a stressor. The body responds to that stressor. There's a slight decrease in resistance, like when a stressor like an exam is presented. And then the body kicks into preparation. And the sympathetic nervous system kicks in with its fight or flight response, and it gets the individual ready to deal with the possible negative consequences of that stress. And so all kinds of physiological responses occur. One of those is a suppression of the immune system. So when that stress is prolonged over a long period of time, the body can't sustain that resistance level. And you get to a certain point and the body goes into exhaustion, and we are now vulnerable to illnesses. So at that point, infection can set in. So this isn't really a great scenario where the primary goal is to avoid a virulent infection and maintain certain behaviors to prevent that, when the behaviors that are designed to prevent our infection are what are creating the stress in many cases, and therefore making us more vulnerable. So it's not a great recipe in the way this has presented itself. We know there have been a number of costs associated with this pandemic. Certainly there have been economic costs at the height of the shutdown and at the height of the problems associated with the pandemic. About 15% of the American people were out of work. That is unprecedented. Our previous levels had dropped below 6%. Yet we have other economic indicators like the stock market going through the roof. So what does that create? Well, you're contributing to the continued income inequality that has presented itself for our country, and that again creates more stress. Certainly there has been political costs associated with this pandemic. The last presidential election and current polarized political climate can potentially create lasting damage to our representative democracy. Remember what happened on January 6th. That was not, hopefully it's a one-off, but there's every reason to believe that there could be other negative consequences associated with the political fallout that we are experiencing. Certainly in terms of social and emotional costs, I've already talked about some of those. Our inability to connect, the separation that we have experienced from loved ones. I don't know about a lot of you. I have 2 children. I have one who lives in California. I have not seen him for a year. I have another one who lives in Cambridge. I have not touched him in over a year. That's really hard on a mom. Moms need to hug their children, and I can't. I haven't seen my mother-in-law, who's 91, for over a year. These are the consequences, and my consequences are minuscule compared to other people who have suffered personal loss and even more isolation. I at least have somebody that I live with, and I tell my husband all the time that he is necessary but not sufficient in terms of my need to socially connect. So when we talk about those costs, right, we have to answer some questions, okay? And the first question that I decided to pose was, why are people so averse to wearing masks? Now, certainly not everybody is, but we're not particularly crazy about it. It's taken a lot to get people to actually comply. And here you see a picture of people who are doubters, right? That say the tests are rigged, the death count is false, masks are useless. And we know that the science tells us that is not the case, but this is where some people are. So how do we explain this? Well, we can use certain psychological principles to help us out here. One psychological theory out there is called reactance. And reactance suggests that when your sense of personal autonomy, right, your sense of independence is threatened, you will react against that and resist the influences that are out there trying to constrain you in terms of your perception of that constraint. So just having and asking people to engage in a behavior that they may not be crazy about and are not used to is already going to put up barriers in terms of what people are willing to do. You combine that with the second point there, that there's no established norms regarding masks. We here in the United States are not used to wearing those. Think about it. The only people before this that we'd see with a surgical mask on was someone in an operating room or performing some sort of medical procedure, right? We don't wear them day to day or season to season. Other countries that have had to deal with other kinds of epidemics or health crises have gotten used to them. They don't think anything of it. They put them on regularly. We here, though, in the United States, have never had to deal with that. And so we have no sense of what's normal, what is expected when it comes to masks. Now we get into conspiracy theories, right? And I'm going to talk more about those further on down the road. But suffice it to say that the rise of those conspiracy theories may be an attempt to create order out of chaos, right? We're living in a chaotic time, a very uncertain time. People are searching for some sort of explanation. That may be one in reason for at least people entertaining some of this. But as I said, stay tuned. There's also been a lack of modeling from the top. Regardless of your political background and regardless of what policies you believe in, we as a people look to our group leaders, those that we value, those that we look up to in terms of knowledge and leadership, to guide us. And we do that more when the situation is ambiguous. The more ambiguous the situation, the more you turn to others to define that situation. And if the people that you value are not providing consistent information about what can be done, people will turn to any source they can to have it create some sort of sense for them. So we want those people in authority to tell us what is correct and what is incorrect. We're really good at responding to those voices. We get used to it when we're children and we continue on with that. And so when those voices are not consistent, when they are casting doubt on previously accepted information sources, it creates a problem. So people are going to resist that, and they came to see masks as sort of an emblem of this ability to be independent and not constrained. So why are people averse to vaccines? I mean, most of us have been vaccinated quite a bit. When we were little, we were used to it. You go to the doctor, you get a shot. I was vaccinated a second time for the measles, mumps, and rubella when I was in graduate school, because there was another outbreak and there was a concern that people who had gotten a vaccine during a certain period of time might not have gotten an active vaccine. So just to be on the safe side, and the school required me to get vaccinated again. I was like, great. I had no problem with that. So what's going on here? Well, many of the same principles can be applied. People may still be engaging in reactance, right? A desire to resist that constraint on their behavior. Again, there is a lack of norms. As I said, most of us were vaccinated as children. This isn't something that we think of as an adult. And that is especially true when you look at the number of people who resist getting a flu shot. And so when you, again, put those together, again, along with the rise of conspiracy theories, which I will get to next, and the politicization of vaccines. So there was a study that was done in 2020 by Hornsby et al., where they looked at the extent to which individuals' attitudes could be impacted by messages from people they valued. So in this case, they looked at those who supported former President Donald Trump. And when those individuals who were his supporters were exposed to Trump tweets that were anti-vax, of which there were a number of, because he had a history of putting out tweets questioning the validity of vaccines in general, but also related to vaccines associated with COVID-19. So when he put those out, when they were exposed to those, as opposed to a group of his supporters who were exposed to a series of his tweets about golf, what you saw was much higher concern and doubt about vaccines than if they were just exposed to his other tweets. So it wasn't about just being exposed to a tweet. It was the information in the tweet. And they also looked at non-supporters of President Trump and found out that there was no opposite impact on liberal voters. In other words, liberal voters didn't become more pro-vaccine once they had been exposed to these negative messages. Their support for vaccines pretty much stayed the same. So what are we seeing here? Well, if you have somebody who has political clout, and he has substantial clout with his followers, and you have that individual casting doubt on even the process of getting a vaccine, apart from this particular circumstance, and that can have a tremendous impact on people who value his opinions with respect to those vaccines. He could have made perhaps some difference with some of his supporters by televising his getting the vaccine instead of it being sort of behind closed doors. That may have gone a long way to assuage some of their concerns and some of their fears with respect to the vaccine and with respect to the virus in general and our efforts to curtail the impact of that virus. So back to conspiracy theories. Why do conspiracy theories rise and why do they last? Well, there's a number of different factors that come into play here. For one thing, we as human beings need to believe in something. We need that belief system to explain the uncertainty in our world. And when that need is not met, or when it is not met to our satisfaction, we will search for something that fills the void. So this is what I meant by seeking order out of chaos, right? So if I can find something that helps me make sense of this in some valid way, I may be willing to cling to that. So that's a first thing. And the more vulnerable the individual is, the more at loose ends they feel, the less sure they are of what has happened in the past, the more likely they may be to be susceptible to some of these ideas that are out there with respect to conspiracy theories. And here you move into this idea of cult-like control. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's necessarily a cult, although I do think QAnon has a number of the requisite attributes associated with it. But if we want to understand what that kind of impact is, you have to understand how cult-like control occurs. When someone else is controlling your social reality, when somebody else presents you with the information that is guiding your belief system, then that is something which you are going to latch onto and buy into, especially if it's from some sort of valued source. And if those sources are wrong and providing misinformation, negative consequences will potentially occur, right? Cults form this way. Individuals who are vulnerable get their psychological needs met by this new group who increasingly controls the social reality. The group feeds the information to the individual. They're going to go to a meeting. Come with us to a meeting. You'll really enjoy it. People are really nice there. Okay, where can I meet you? Oh no, we'll drive. We'll pick you up and we'll drive. The more control you cede over to someone else, the more dependent you become on that individual. And that individual gets more control over you. And so now you're dependent on them for your ride. You're dependent on them to tell you what's correct, what's incorrect. And so the more misinformation that's presented to you, and the more you buy into their social reality, the more committed to the group. And you will go to great lengths to defend that choice, to defend that commitment. And that brings us to cognitive dissonance theory. So what cognitive dissonance theory suggests is that when you have two inconsistent beliefs or thoughts, or a thought and a behavior which are inconsistent, as when that happens, you can experience an uncomfortable psychological state. And that uncomfortable psychological state is referred to as dissonance. Okay, so what happens with respect to conspiracy theories, right? I say to myself, I'm a smart person. I know what's right from wrong, right? I listen to these people. That seems to make some sense. I tell others about how this point of view seems to make some sense. Now you present me with the possibility that I'm wrong. I'm going to resist that, okay? And the more that I identify those initial statements, right, with those opinions, the more it's out there, the less able I am to take that back. I can't take back the behavior that's out there. I can't take back the fact that I have said these things and that I believe these things. I can't take back, and I won't take back, the idea that I'm a smart person. So what's left to change? Oh, your information that this is wrong has to be, you're wrong, right? You're just out to get us, right? And the more effort that you have put in to commit to that particular point of view, we call it effort justification, the more entrenched you become, right? Because to admit you're wrong is to admit a failing on your part. It's to admit that you're not as smart as you thought you were. And we are not willing to do that. We will go to great lengths to protect our self-esteem, okay? And so that becomes very, very powerful. When you're presented with a state of dissonance, you only have so many choices available to you. You can change your belief, which is unlikely if it's closely associated with a sense of who you are. You can change the behavior, right? Or you can rationalize the behavior and come up with other thoughts that help everything make sense, that help it all add up again. And this can be a very powerful potential attitude change process. If I can get people to see the inconsistency in a way that isn't threatening to their sense of self, I have a shot at changing their minds. And I'll give you an example. My students will have heard this example before because it was just so textbook. I had a conversation once with my mother, who is no longer with us. So forgive me, Mom, but I think you'll appreciate it. And my mom was a very, very devout Catholic. This was a woman who knelt down beside her bed every day till the day she died to say her prayers. Very, very devout and very, very consistent in terms of her beliefs with respect to Catholicism. Yet she also had very, very conservative political beliefs. And I remember I'd come home from college once and we were having a conversation, and she was talking about capital punishment and her support of it. And I said, what? That doesn't make sense. And she said, why? What do you mean? And I said, well, you believe in capital punishment. You think that that is a correct political policy, but you also believe in what the church says. And the church doesn't agree with capital punishment. So how do you reconcile those? Now, I knew to a certain extent what I was doing. I knew my mother would never change her sense of self. She would never change her belief system. She would never say, well, the church is wrong. That just wasn't in her DNA. She was much more likely to change her attitude, her political stance with respect to capital punishment. And she did. She made it consistent, which I was very happy for because I thought, at least you're being consistent with your understanding of what the church is saying and making that consistent with your political beliefs. So there are ways of actually shifting those things and changing them. And then the last one here that I put down here is conformity pressure. So conformity is the real or imagined influence of others. You don't have to have someone explicitly tell you to do something. You just have to believe that they want you to do that in order for that social influence to have an impact on you. Once you are part of a group and are rationalizing your belief system, that group can then exert pressure. There was another study that was done in 2020 looking specifically at anti-quarantine groups, and found that they exhibited many of the symptoms that are associated with a faulty decision-making process called groupthink, which has been very extensively researched. And one of the symptoms of groupthink is conformity pressure. So in an effort to maintain the cohesive nature of the group, when people are committed to the group and the group is committed to staying together, the members of the group will create this conformity pressure on individuals in the group to tamp down any dissent, to lead to often follow whatever a directive leader says, and to bring people in line, okay, to maintain that cohesion, okay, and often the group leader makes those decisions. One of the other precursors of a groupthink is a directive leader. And what they found looking at these anti-quarantine groups is that when they were asked about why they were engaging in this behavior and various other kinds of questions, they tended to sort of have this sense of inflated morality, which is something that goes with groupthink. There's conformity pressure. There are people who actually function to quiet the naysayers in an effort to sort of promote this misinformation. And we know that that information will be well thought of by individuals, right? That information which is compatible with other known information that you have, if it's from whatever you decide is a credible source, if you see other people believing it, if there is internal consistency to that information, and if there's any kind of supportive evidence, whether it's accurate or not presented, it will be believed. And that's something that researchers have figured out, okay? But what they also have figured out is that information has to be easy to hear and has to be easy to read. People don't want to do a lot of work, right? We make our students do a lot of work with information. That's part of our job. But the average person, not so much on a day-to-day basis. So I think what you can see here is that there are a lot of factors that can come into play, right, to help us understand why is it these people will believe these things that seem so strange and seem so counterintuitive to others of us. So that kind of brings us to a particular point, right? If we've got this situation where people are engaging in dissonance reduction, in aspects of groupthink, if they're feeling conformity pressure, if other people are defining their social reality, what are we supposed to do? How can we actually make these things change? Well, one thing we can do is establish new norms. Now, most of you know that norms are accepted societal rules that we pressure other people to engage in. And those aren't necessarily, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We do it to maintain social order, and it works really, really well. Some norms are what are defined as descriptive. This is just what people do. If I tell you what is normative, there is a chance you will go along with it, if only to be like everybody else. There are also prescriptive, or what we call injunctive norms, which define more clearly what you should do, right? So what is the requirement there? You put a combination of those two together. You tell people, here's what others are doing, and here's what you should do, and you can get powerful behavior change. And I think some students in one of my research methods classes sort of illustrated this on St. Anselm campus. They wanted to know whether or not students were adhering to some of the aspects of the campus compact, specifically whether people were following signage. And there's all kinds of signage up all over campus. If you haven't been on campus, you can't go in certain buildings a way you might normally have gone in the past. There's normally exits. Stairways are marked one direction only, all in an effort to minimize closeness so that we can maintain that social distance. And there was a general thought on the part of my students that there was no way people were following those rules, especially when it came to the student center. It was roundabout and difficult, and people would just violate it all over the place. But they'd be more likely to do that violation in the evening, when there was no sense of explicit authority around in the form of faculty, staff, and monastics. During the day, they would be more likely to follow it, but at night, you'd see more rule breakers. So my students did an observational study where they actually staked themselves out at appropriate places in the student center. One student watched the door, another one watched the stairway, and just recorded how many people complied and how many people did not comply. And what they found was that, first of all, the overwhelming number of people complied, and there was no real difference between night and day. So there wasn't this sense of, well, nobody's looking, I can get away with it. And you want to try and understand, so why is that? Is it just that St. Anselm students are more compliant in general? Well, maybe it's a combination of things in the terms of the descriptive norms, so they could see what other people were doing, and the prescriptive norms of what you ought to do. And that's combined all over campus with an encouragement to comply with the college compact. And in certain areas, not all, but in certain areas, it seems like we've been somewhat successful. So that's the good news. The bad news is it doesn't work in every single type of behavior, but at least that was a sort of an interesting little demonstration that my students were able to illustrate there. The other thing that can happen is once you establish those norms, you want to use education to try and reinforce those norms, right? So you listen to the science, not the politicians. And that has been shown to be effective in research. Even anecdotally, I was watching the news, and this cable news had a group of individuals who were skeptical about the use of masks, vaccines, social distancing. And rather than hearing from a politician, they heard from scientists who had never been affiliated or associated with anybody in any administration. And once that was over, this group of people who were very anti anything that had to do with constraining their behavior were much more amenable to the idea that, maybe this makes sense. And they even said, I don't want to hear from a politician, but I'll listen to the scientists. They've got nothing to gain here, perhaps. And so that seems to be effective once the idea of what's normative gets introduced, right? Another thing that sort of feeds into this is this idea of, appropriately called in the persuasion literature, inoculation. Another way of looking at it is something that has been called pre-bunking. So if you present individuals with the misinformation that's out there before they've had a chance to really ingest it and evaluate it, what that can do is it can sort of function like a vaccine, in the sense that that misinformation is presented to individuals along with information which identifies why it's not worthwhile information. What's the evidence that suggests that it's wrong? So when you present that to individuals, what it does is it gives them an opportunity to create counter arguments, what you would think of from in a medical model as antibodies, right? And once those counter arguments are in place, then when misinformation is presented to them later in perhaps a stronger form, they're much more able to resist it and not listen to it. So that seems to be, from some early research on misinformation, seems to be something that works. The last couple of points that I have here are things that I think are sometimes difficult, certainly this next one, to listen to the people you disagree with and don't dismiss automatically out of hand the conspiracy theory. I know this from, I have siblings who believe in sort of the whole herd immunity thing that was going around for a while. Just let everybody get it. And once we get herd immunity, everything will be fine. You just isolate the other people. And somehow it's okay to isolate them, but not the individuals who were espousing this. But that's a whole nother thing. But the idea here is that when you listen to that, rather than saying to somebody, you're out of your mind, what do you know? You're crazy, right? What they hear is, not my ideas are crazy, I'm crazy personally. When you dismiss the theory, you dismiss the person. And once you've done that, you've lost your window of opportunity to be able to convince them that maybe they were wrong or misinformed or misled, right? So you have to, and this is very, very difficult given the current political climate, to listen quietly, to ask them, what is it you really believe? Why do you believe it? Where's your evidence? Explain to me how this evidence is valid. And then in that question, you can present those seeds of doubt and possibly get that person to move in a different direction. And then when you do this, you make your pitch about caring as a moral imperative, that it's not about control. It's not about winning. It's about caring, right? Making people think of themselves, reminding those people that they are good people, that they are valued, right? And that as good people, shouldn't they also care about you? And how is that going to be shown if they're engaging in those behaviors? And so this, I think, sort of circles back to perhaps why we were more effective, at least in getting people to enter and exit buildings properly of St. A's, because I do think that we approached it as a moral imperative, as I care about you, I'm asking you to care about me, and I want to care for you, and I'm hoping that you will care for me. And so if it's put on that level and you are listening to the person and not dismissing them, you've got a much better opportunity to change minds and change hearts. So that's my spiel. I wanted to leave enough time for people to ask some questions. I could talk about this stuff all night. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and throw it back to Dr. Holder, I guess.
We already have one question. Are there certain traits or characteristics that make people more susceptible to some of the theories you have discussed here?
I think that certainly there is some evidence, as I mentioned, individuals who are vulnerable. Well, what does that mean? Individuals who don't have as strong a set of social connections, individuals who may feel more alienated, individuals who certainly may feel more depressed. Those are individuals who will be searching for some sort of validation, some sort of answer that is out there. And if that answer is not coming to them through the people that they know and love, or through their sort of accepted institutions, they will search for other opportunities. So I think that, you know, if you know somebody who is struggling with some of those misconceptions, it may very well be that they're feeling sort of untethered and at a loss in their lives, and they need some sort of structure, and that provides them with structure.
We will take other questions in the Q&A function. While I'm waiting on some of those, I'm going to ask some of my own because, well, because I get the chance. So we saw, and you noted just briefly what happened January 6th. And we saw so many people say, I know that we're being lied to. You know, short of having 74 million deep conversations with individuals, is there any way, as a social psychologist, to talk about how that needle could be moved?
Well, I guess here the way it can be moved for large numbers of people is to go back to the individuals who have some level of influence over those people. If they're not going to listen to you and me, who will they listen to? And can we convince those people that it is in their interests, right, to move those people away from these rather destructive ways of thinking, because they are destructive. And I think they're destructive in a political sense, in an economic sense, in a social sense, I mean, on down the line. It may take things like the almighty dollar to actually lead those individuals, to put some pressure on them to change, those political officials. So those leaders have to be brave enough to come out and say, this was wrong. You know, the election was not stolen. It was a valid election. One side got more votes from the other, just like what happened in 2016. It just happened in another direction. And so we need to accept this and we need to move forward. But until they hear that from people they value, they're not going to listen to the people that they think have a different agenda and are lying to them.
Another attendee notes, we live in a highly politicized time, and this has, I believe, become a politicized issue. How would you advise disconnecting issues of pandemic from issues of politics in order to cultivate more meaningful conversations? That's a really great question.
Yeah, it is. And I think the key goes back to listening to the science and not the politicians, and having scientists out there who don't have or have never, no one has created the perception that they have something to gain for delivering their message. You know, we've been unfortunate that even some of our scientists have been put in this politicized position, right? That, you know, Dr. Fauci is out there and he's somehow profiting from espousing his particular point of view. You know, that others have somehow profited from this. That's why I think in those cases, when you bring in scientists who do not have any affiliation or perception of affiliation with either side, that they've got nothing to gain here except to tell you the truth. So just let them tell you the truth and see if that can move them a little bit.
Another question. What role do you think social psychology has played in the exponential increase of COVID-19 related racism toward the directed toward the Asian community?
Well, now you're getting into the field of prejudice and stereotyping, of which is part of social psychology. And certainly, I think when people are frightened, when people are uncertain, they tend to gravitate towards that which confirms their view of the world. And if their view of the world is these people who are other are the problem, then that again helps make sense of the world for them. And so they latch onto it that much tighter. And so I think that combined with some of the general tenor of what we've been hearing for during the last administration, demonizing people of color, has sort of snowballed into this desire to find who's at fault. Because if I can point at who's at fault, then I don't have to take any responsibility for anything I or my country has done that has contributed to this problem. Because it's not me, it's them, and I'm off scot-free. My anxiety goes down and I put it all on somebody else. Scapegoating works really, really well for that. And that's why it continues. It's very self-reinforcing.
Next question, thinking back to the beginning of the pandemic, would you say that the persistence of things such as mask wearing and social distancing has made people less likely to follow the recommendations given to us?
Oh, I think that that's a question about the fatigue that has come with this. And absolutely, we're all tired of it. We want that human contact. We need that. And it's been denied to us for a long time. We think we're pretty much on the other side. So what difference will it make if I just, hop down for spring break? So what? Everything is pretty well fine. The numbers are down. It'll be okay. And that's what the experts have warned us is the absolute problem. And now we're starting to see this uptick again as states have reopened. And I know there is tremendous desire to get our economic machine working again. But there is this huge stimulus package that's coming in. Businesses may be able to hold out just a little longer till more of us get vaccinated so they can open up more completely in a safer manner. But I think people are just so tired, and you put that with the idea that there's a light at the end of the tunnel and we're done. It's all going to be better. It's over.
Next one, QAnon seemed to have another dimension. Disconnected hints were presented to members by Q that prompted members to create their own connections, resulting in a multiplicity of conspiracy theories. It seemed like an ever-evolving game in which there could be no clear winner or a fantasy novel written by authors who didn't know one another and yet created a common world. Not sure there's a question there.
Maybe it's a comment. I don't disagree. I think that there is no, people see in Q what they want to see in Q, and others who spin connections, and somebody looks at that and says, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? That again provides an opportunity for someone to jump on it and say, you know what? You're right. That does make a lot of sense, right? I'm okay. I get it. See, it was always hidden. And it's very convenient because every time Q is wrong, they have an out. Oh, it's not what it was really meant, right? And the dissonance is reduced. It's what happens with doomsday cults.
Right. Another one, some of the changes that have come about because of the pandemic have actually been positive. Yet there is a strong desire by many people to get back to normal. One example is that at my workplace, our meetings have become more productive because we've been able to detach from groupthink to some extent and are hearing more voices and a wider variety of opinions. The loud, aggressive people are no longer dominating the conversation. How do we start a conversation about how it may be worthwhile to preserve these positive changes and not just return to normal when there is such a strong attachment to the idea of normal?
Well, I think if certain protocols are established for meetings, it's worked out really well for us to at least start the meeting by everybody giving me some input. I want to continue that, and I want to make sure that everybody has that time. And I'm going to, as the leader, make sure those people have that time. So if I hear anybody sort of stepping out and talking over, I'm going to stop it, because this is, so I think it's really up to the group and the leaders of the group to decide what those protocols will be and what has worked efficiently and what hasn't. I mean, I don't think anybody thinks the world is going to go back to exactly the way it was before. Businesses are not going to, you're not going to see, a couple of million people filing into the city of Boston every day to fill up those high-rise skyscrapers where the businesses are. Businesses are smart. They found out they can get the same level of productivity out of their people if their people get to stay home. And if you've got kids back at school, the businesses are going to take advantage of that. It's interesting. We went in that direction for a while, and then businesses pulled back and pulled people back into the office because they said people need the social connection. Well, we didn't have Zoom then. So maybe, more of these teleconferencing kinds of techniques will be used, obviously more judiciously and not so in such a saturated sense that we're using them now, so that they become more targeted and people are satisfied with those making their way into sort of our regular business and perhaps school day. I mean, I hate to disappoint kids, but I think snow days may be a thing of the past, given the ease with which Zoom has enabled us to have remote learning. So that might come every once in a while. And kids might actually come to enjoy it, sort of a modified snow day where they get part of the day with their teacher online, but they still get to enjoy the fact that they have a day off.
I think I'm going to make this the last question, but knowing that people have struggled with depression, anxiety, etc., how do we try and balance the mental health of individuals who are struggling during isolation with also trying to ask people to act for, in essence, the common good?
Yeah, and that is a great question, because mental health issues are things that are going to have this situation we're in is going to have ramifications for mental health issues long into the future, unfortunately. But I think that making those social connections, providing that support where it can be provided, even if it's just in a virtual sense. For example, my husband, when he talks to his mother every night now, he never did that before. He talks to her every night, and he does it over FaceTime. So as long as she's able to see people, she is much happier. And even during the worst of it, when she was so isolated, and she actually contracted COVID-19 and thankfully did not get a horrible case, although it made for an interesting Christmas because we had to transport her at one point. So that meant we were vulnerable, and but she came out the other side okay. And I think in large part, and I encouraged my kids to do it. She could see people, if she could connect with them that way, that at least is perhaps a bridge to the end. And then once people are out, sort of reestablish those contacts in person, even if it's just outside at a distance.
Well, I want to say thank you so much, Liz. This has been a wonderful lecture. So, well, so many important factors that you were talking about. And I would invite those still gathered to give Liz their thanks. I also want to invite everyone on April 20th, we will have the final lecture of this series this year. It will be Dean Cronin, Father Augustine, and Professor Beth Salerno talking on various things that we have learned from COVID-19. So again, thank you, Liz, and I thank you on behalf of the Honors Council. What a great evening this was.
You were quite welcome. I was glad to do it.